When I was growing up, just after the end of the Second World War, there were signs of the war all around. Old gas masks, helmets tossed away in the shed, massive bomb craters littered around London. There were reminders everywhere. And I knew people who had been injured, who had been killed in the Blitz and in the rain of V1 and V2 rockets later in the war. But I really regret that I never asked my parents or their friends more about what actually happened, what it was really like. Having lived in East Sheen for over 35 years, it's remarkable that it's still possible to piece together some of the stories of what it was like when V1 and V2 rockets were crashing into this neighbourhood, causing terrible death and destruction. It's a story that deserves to be remembered. East Sheen 60 years ago. It's 1944 and the Allies appeared to be winning the war. The Blitz had come and gone. The U-boat menace was over. The German armies were being pushed back. All seemed rosy in London, but Hitler had another nasty surprise up his sleeve. The flying bombs. The V1 and V2 rockets were the first weapons of mass destruction. Top German scientists had worked on them for several years before the war. The V1 was a bit like a jet aeroplane and was launched from a ramp. It flew at 500 miles an hour and it was just about possible for opposition guns and aeroplanes to shoot them down. But most of the V1s got through, and when the engine cut out and they fell to earth, they caused enormous damage. One man who was greatly affected by all of this and the incoming flying bombs was a man called Frank Wood, who lived across the road here at number 43 in Vernon Road. He was chief of the leader of the local ARP, that's the Air Raid Precaution Unit. He was an air raid warden and he was in charge of this locality. Frank was highly respected. He was a very well organised, very efficient man, and he was in charge of this locality, this neighbourhood. And one of the things that makes his experience so valuable for us is that throughout that period he kept a very detailed log day to day of what was happening in his neighbourhood. And it's an absolute treasure chest of material for understanding what it was like in Mortlake and East Sheen during the war. Frank was also something of an artist and added his own illustrations. Air raid wardens had numerous tasks, but one of the most important at this period for Frank was keeping track of flying bombs coming into London from the south and southeast. Here on the railway bridge at South Walpole Way was a perfect position to get a view right across the whole area. It was on this bridge here that Frank had his own first direct experience of a flying bomb, which he describes graphically in his own log.
Down to the railway bridge for a look at the fly bombs before turning in. Nothing very near. Then a pinpoint of light appeared low down in the sky, almost due south, a little to the east. We watched it and speculated. No, it was not moving, and yet we could not make up our minds. But almost at once there was a terrific swishing noise, followed at once by a big explosion and a huge shower of sparks. A fly bomb had been approaching us head-on, and thus was apparently not moving. And it had glided in to crash only a few hundred yards from us.
That particular V1 landed in Palmerston Road, and you can still see very clearly the newer style of houses that had replaced those that were destroyed. Indeed, there are telltale signs of bomb damage all over Sheen and Barnes, where new buildings were put up on the site of wrecked houses. At White Hart Lane, for instance, at Richmond Park Road, and at Leinster Avenue. As for 43 Vernon Road, the Woods family home, that was fated to be another victim of V1 rockets.
I turned in just after midnight and knew nothing more until I awoke, not more than half an hour later, and what an awakening. The house was falling about all over the place. Under the Morrison shelter we crouched still, 3 of us sleeping crossways to get more room, and waited a few moments until the sound of falling debris had ceased.
The third person under the Morrison shelter was Frank's daughter Sheila, and she can remember it all too clearly.
I remember that there was the smell of sort of plaster, and there was a lot of dust around. Everything had all the ceilings obviously had fallen down. We were in the back room, luckily, because the front room was far worse in damage, and the French doors at the back had been blown out.
Were you frightened by the V1?
Not really. I'd been woken up by all the noise of the house coming down about us, and I really didn't have time to be frightened, I don't think.
And here's how Frank remembered it.
I switched on my torch, handy under my pillow, and managed to get to the light switch. The whole room was thick with plaster dust, and it was difficult to see even the short distance from one end of the room to the other. By the luck of the gods, I picked up my glasses from the mantelpiece, unbroken.
It was his birthday that day. It was his 40th birthday, so what a birthday present.
From the screams which continued unceasingly outside, I knew that there was trouble in plenty. I found my boots and tipped out some of the debris and thrust them on. I searched for my jacket, which I found smothered in debris and dust at the foot of the stairs. No sign of the tumbler with my dentures, but I had wasted enough time already and could wait no longer.
It was just a question of walking over rubble to get out. I vaguely remember that, and because the front door had gone, we just walked straight out.
I ventured a few yards into Glendower Road and knew I had no need to look further for the seat of the damage. It was right on my own doorstep. Apart from the heaps of debris immediately around me, the roofless houses of Church Avenue seemed to impress themselves on my mind as much as anything.
Frank made a very detailed report. Part of his report included a map of the streets affected by the explosion. So here you see there's Glendower Road, which I'm in now, Vernon Road and Church Avenue. There were 6 houses which were massively damaged in Glendower Road on one side of the road, another 6 on the other side of the road, another 6 in Church Avenue, and lots of damage of a lesser kind all around the area. You'll see dotted around these circles with C and TC. The C stands for casualty and TC stands for trapped casualty. By chance, I know somebody who came into that category of trapped. They lived at number 2 Glendower Road across there. She was a young woman at the time. Her name was Joyce Turner. I got to know her years later, of course, but she was a secretary, a young secretary of the BBC. She was asleep in her bed when the explosion, when the flying bomb landed right opposite her. Suddenly she could see stars, literally. The ceiling, the roof had gone, torn off by the blast. She could hear her father screaming in agony down below. And then, awfully, the screams fell silent. It took ages for her and her mother upstairs to be rescued. Ladders had to be brought up and they were lifted out through the roof. And it was days before they discovered that far from being killed in the explosion, her father was alive. He was injured, he'd been taken to hospital, but thankfully he was alive. Not everybody was as lucky as Joyce and her family. They survived in number 2, but right across the street at number 5, it was a very different story.
I got a bit of a shock when I heard of my first fatal casualties. Mr. and Mrs. Wooler of 5 Glendower Road. and I immediately recalled that Jean, their daughter, was away. But amid the excitement of it all, I wondered how Sheila would take the news.
Mr. and Mrs. Wooler, I knew them very well. Their daughter Jean was a great friend of mine. We were great pals. As it happened, Jean wasn't there that night. She was away somewhere. And so that was a blessing. But I can remember, I wasn't told the fact that they died straight away. I remember going along the Upper Richmond Road with my mother, and we met somebody she knew, and I remember her telling these people that Mr. and Mrs. Wooler had died, and that was how I found out.
The Woolers were not the only fatalities.
Suddenly I was asked for the occupants of number 18 Church Avenue. Mr. and Mrs. Bates lived there according to my register, and it appeared that their house was completely destroyed. Mr. Bates was soon eliminated. It appeared that he was away from home, but Mrs. Bates's body was subsequently recovered, and I had to call back the mortuary van which had already removed the Woolers an hour or so before. I detailed Jimmy Hume and Ashby to stand guard over the stretcher, a rotten job and one I didn't like, possibly on account of my recollections of the Putney affair last November, when I stood guard over about 30 or so mangled corpses stacked on the pavement.
How aware were you of how much damage had been done to your neighbours' and friends' houses on the night itself?
Well, I mean, they were damaged very, very badly. Our house was condemned at first. They said they couldn't rebuild it, but they did rebuild it in the end. Obviously, there were several houses that had to be pulled down and were completely rebuilt.
And how was it the morning after when you saw things in daylight?
Well, I remember my standing with my mother and father at that junction with Church Avenue and looking across at the house. And then I think it sort of struck me how bad things were. And I think it was then my father said, well, you know, they won't be able to rebuild it, I don't think. But luckily, we moved somewhere else for a year, and after a year we were able to move back.
When you read that diary, which is very graphic, what do you feel?
Well, because the whole diary contains details of all the incidents that my father attended, but this one is, of course, personal, and I'm naturally more interested. And I learnt things from that diary that I didn't know previously. For instance, he apparently, a few months before, he went to Mr. and Mrs. Wooler at number 5 to advise them where to place their Morrison shelter. And of course, there was a direct hit on number 5, and they were killed. And the shelter, you know, was sort of bent right in like a V shape.
A month later, the air raid wardens were confronted with an even bigger problem, the V2 rockets.
The rockets were about 40 feet in length. They were fired from bases in Holland. They were estimated to attain a height of about 50 or 60 miles and a speed of over 1,000 miles per hour, which of course is a good deal faster than the speed of sound. This was perhaps the most disturbing feature about them, for they had arrived and blown up before they could be heard on the way. And the curious thing was that the noise of the rocket travelling through the sky could be heard for some seconds after the thing had landed and blown up.
The first of the V2 rockets fell not far from Mortlake, in Staveley Road in Chiswick. Dennis Sealby, Sheila's future husband, was growing up in North Warple Way at the time, and Dennis remembers that first V2 very well.
One evening I was fully dressed in my scout uniform to go down to the 2nd Mortlake Scouts to take a badge. I would have walked down to the hut and the necessary scoutmaster would have been there to have tested me for my badge. But which particular badge, I can't honestly remember. And I opened the kitchen door at the back of the house to go out, and there was an incredible explosion and a lot of smoke and fumes rising from the ground the other side of the river.
Frank Wood had also heard the V2 explode.
I dashed out to the street and at once spotted a great column of thick black smoke and dust to the north of us and at no great distance. Heads were now appearing at doors and windows all down the road, and everybody was speculating on the cause of the explosion. The popular guess was that the ammunition dump on the Home Guard practice ground just across the river had blown up.
The message that got around the community was, oh, it was a gas main exploded. And no more information became available.
I went to the post and made inquiries from there. I was told by control that I could probably guess the cause. That could mean only one thing: a long-range rocket. And this is what it eventually proved to be, although a report which was quickly spread all over London gave the cause as a broken gas main.
Did you go over to Chiswick to see what had caused the damage?
No. Oh, no. No, it wasn't part. I didn't usually go across the river for anything. Everything was on our side of the river.
Do you remember being frightened during the war?
Not really. I remember coming out of the house to try and pick up shrapnel. One would hear it whizzing through the sky, and then you'd hear it fall and you'd rush over and pick it up, all nice and warm, because we had a lot of anti-aircraft guns in Richmond Park, and also there were searchlights in Richmond Park.
The V2 rockets could have bombed Britain into submission, but fortunately the Allied armies were advancing rapidly towards Germany and managed to overrun the launching sites before too much damage could be done. By May the 2nd, 1945, Frank was able with much satisfaction to make the following entry.
May the 2nd. On this day, about 5 3/4 years since our stand to on the last day of August 1939, we received our expected instructions to close the post and stand down all personnel.
Well, I was particularly proud of my father doing all the work with his wardens and everything he'd done, and I was very proud when I read the letter that he'd received from the Chief Warden, and I'll read it to you now. Dear Wood, I have written an official letter to the post, but I also wish to send you a personal note to thank you for your own splendid effort under most trying circumstances. No one could have passed a single criticism if you had stayed at home to be with your wife and daughter, but instead you turned out and conducted a most difficult incident in an ideal manner. And I can truthfully say no incident has ever been tackled by anyone in a more efficient manner, and you are to be highly complimented on your wonderful effort.
Well done, Frank Wood, another local hero. Public servants like him really do deserve to be remembered. With people like him around, Hitler never really had a chance.